الكريم أما بعد سبحانك لا علم لنا إلا ما علمتنا إنك أنت العليم الحكيم رب اشرح لي صدري ويسر لي أمري واحلل عقدة من لساني يفقهوا قولي. Just a correction from last night, we began the chapter. The 50th chapter of the book itself was known as Babul Khawf, the chapter of the fear of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. The chapter that I mentioned last night was something that was covered, it was a misprint in the book. And the next chapter, which is the 51st chapter of Riyad-us Saliheen, is called Babul Raja, the chapter of the mercy of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, or the hope in Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. So the last chapter that we covered was known as the chapter of the fear of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, and this chapter itself is the chapter of the hope in Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. And that serves very similar to how the pattern in the Quran actually goes. Wherever Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala mentions, subhanAllah, his punishment, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala mentions his mercy as well. Whenever he mentions his adab, he mentions his forgiveness as well, right? That goes hand to hand in the Quran, everywhere. Whenever you see an ayat of the Quran that talks about Jahannam, most likely after that ayat of the Quran, the tazkirah, or the reminder of Jannah is also mentioned. That there is always hope in the Quran. There's always hope that the Quran reminds us in all aspects of our lives. So, inshallah, we begin the 51st chapter of the book Riyad-us Saliheen, and the chapter is known as Babur Raja, which means hope in Allah's mercy. And as we know that Imam al-Nawawi rahmatullah alayhi usually brings a chapter with few ayats of the Quran. We'll begin with the ayat of the Quran, chapter 39, Surah Zumar, verse number 53. And Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala mentions and says, بَعْدَ أَعُوذُ بِاللَّهِ مِنَ الشَّيْطَانِ الرَّجِيمِ قُلْ يَا عِبَادِيَ الَّذِينَ أَسْرَفُوا عَلَىٰ أَنفُسِهِمْ لَا تَقْنَطُوا مِنْ رَحْمَةِ اللَّهِ إِنَّ اللَّهَ يَغْفِرُ الذُّنُوبَ جَمِيعًا إِنَّهُ هُوَ الْغَفُورُ الرَّحِيمُ. In this very ayat of the Quran, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala mentions to his Habib, the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam, by saying, قُلْ, O Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam, announce, Ya ibadi, O my servants, O my people. And subhanAllah, brothers and sisters, in this ayat of the Quran shows the utmost mercy, rahmah, and forgiveness of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. That irrespective of how far you have gone from Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, Allah says, you are still my servant. You are still my abd. You are still my creation. Right? In dunya itself, and this is how we function in this world, that if someone has wronged someone, like for example, a child has done something wrong at home, even a beloved mother or father will say, you're not my son, you're not my daughter. They say this in words like these, like, you're not my son anymore, you're not my daughter anymore. And this is just frustration and anger that people have. Even though they don't want to dissociate, but this is an anger that they have. But even with all of the wrongs, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says, oh my Habib, announced to the people and said, Ya ibadi, you are still my servant. You are still my people. You are still my abd. And then Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala further goes and says, الَّذِينَ أَسْرَفُوا عَلَىٰ أَنفُسِهِمْ. Those that have transgressed. Israf in Arabic means when you overdo something. Extravagance, transcend, you go through and cross the limits of something. Not only that you have sinned, but you crossed the limits of sinning. You went so far that it feels like there's no returning back. That's what asrafu in Arabic means. That you've gone so far that it feels like, you know what, I'm not even sure if I can come back. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says, oh my servant, alladhina asrafu. Those who have gone so far away that feels like there's no coming back, and they have done dhulm upon themselves, meaning they have transgressed the limits of Allah by disobeying. La taqnatu min rahmatillah. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala mentions, do not despair of the mercy of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Imagine those who have not sinned that much, small sins, little ones. How much rahmat and mercy of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Verily, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala forgives all sins. Truly, He is all forgiving and the most merciful. And as we know that from amongst the many interpretations or the reasons of revelation, this ayat of the Quran was directly related to the Islam of Wahshi bin Harb radiallahu anhu. Wahshi radiallahu anhu is a man who took the life of the most beloved person to Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam, his own uncle Hamza radiallahu anhu. And when the Prophet ﷺ approached Hamza, Wahshi, radiallahu anh, to accept Islam, he said, no, I'm not going to accept Islam. Too hard. Accept Islam, make tawbah, and do all of these things. I can't do this. إِلَّا مَنْ تَابَ وَآمَنَ وَعَمِلَ عَمَلًا صَالِحًا. He says, no, that's too much. I can't. Then the ayat of the Quran was sent to him through a messenger that Allah says in the Quran, إِنَّ اللَّهَ لَا يَغْفِرُ أَن يُشْرَكَ بِهِ وَيَغْفِرُ مَا دُونَ ذَلِكَ لِمَن يَشَاءُ. Allah doesn't forgive shirk. Allah will forgive everything else. He says, no, I can't take chances. Allah says, مَن يَشَاءُ. What if Allah doesn't forgive me? I'm not taking any chance. What if Allah doesn't forgive me? And the ayat of the Quran says, مَن يَشَاءُ. So then this ayat was sent through Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala to Jibreel Islam, to the Prophet, to Wahshi, where Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says, Ya ibadi alladhina asrafu ala anfusihim, la taqnatu min rahmatillah. And that's the time when Wahshi came. He covered his face. He entered the masjid and he said, Ya Rasulullah, I accept Islam. I accept Islam. And he says, Al-an, this is the ayat of the Quran. So my dear respected brothers and elders, for all of us, in our own internal lives, in our own internal actions, this ayat is one of the greatest reminders that irrespective of how we have spent our lives, how far we have gone from Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, Allah is still Kareem, Allah is forgiving, Allah is loving, and Allah is always there to accept us. And Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala always consider us His abd. Ya ibadi, O my servant. Doesn't matter how far we have gone. So the rahmat of Allah, the mercy of Allah is infinite. So inshallah, in this very chapter of the Quran, we'll go through many ayats and many ahadith of the Prophet ___ that reminds us of his continuous mercy. But one thing to remember, that with this mercy, we should not begin to cross the limits and the hudud of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Just because someone's parents are nice doesn't mean that you have to disobey them. Just because someone is nice to you doesn't mean that you can treat them badly. So that doesn't mean that Allah is merciful, that we can keep on sinning, but it's a reminder that no sin is greater than the mercy of Allah. No sin is greater than the rahmah and the mercy of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. May Allah give us tawfiq and ability to practice whatever good has been shown. Subhanallah wa bihamdihi, subhanaka wa bihamdik, nashhadu an la ilaha illa anta, nastaghfiruka wa natubu ilayk.